It's an honor for me today to be speaking with David Barsamian. He's a human rights activist that all of us look up to, and his boundless energy for these causes, keeps the human rights spirit alive. Kashmir is one of those conflicts that were considered flashpoints that had the potential to become regional conflicts. So before I start with the current situation, I would like to give you a little brief historical perspective of that. When British were leaving India, which was Indian subcontinent in 1947, a partition agreement was agreed by the two liberation movements, which was Indian Congress and Pakistan, All India Muslim League. And in those partition agreements, it was decided that the princely states that had Muslim majority will have an option to concede to Pakistan and become part of Pakistan. And there were many at that time: Hyderabad, Kalat in Balochistan, Pakistan, Kashmir. And Kashmir at that time was ruled by a Maharaja called Hari Singh under a special agreement with legal agreement with the British Empire. So, and at that time, that Kashmir state had 80% Muslim population. So the expectation was that when the plebiscite happens, that they will opt for Pakistan and become part of Pakistan. In that context, in October 1947, the retiring Viceroy, Lord Mountbatten, wrote a letter to Hari Singh that this plebiscite should be conducted at an earliest date so that the issue could be settled. But Hari Singh hesitated, and he invited Indian armed forces to come inside Kashmir. And that became the cause for the first conflict between India and Pakistan, which started towards the end of 1947, and hostilities were conducted for 2 months period. In early 1948, United Nations announced and organized a ceasefire between India and Pakistan. And the forces, wherever they were, they decided on a line of control. And that's how the border is still called, the line of control, LOC. Then, in the later part of 1948, UN Security Council passed 2 resolutions in which it was required that India will organize a plebiscite so that the Kashmiri people can decide their fate and decide if they want to become part of Pakistan or not. But India, instead of organizing that plebiscite, moved more of their armed forces in the occupied region. And now at this point, we have close to around 500,000 Indian troops in the Kashmir Valley, which is a total population of around 12.5 million people, which translates into 1 soldier for every 20 citizens. Now imagine in Fresno, if there is a soldier standing at every corner, requiring all of you to show your IDs or your intents or where are you going, where are you coming from, that becomes a very difficult situation for civilian population. And it's kind of like a big, pretty jail where you have to answer for all your movements and your actions. So that is a human rights situation there in Kashmir right now. Just to give you an idea, the Human Rights Watch issued a report, and I will read a small excerpt from it. It says that the Indian security forces have assaulted civilians during search operations, tortured and summarily executed detainees in custody, and murdered civilians in reprisal attacks. Rape most often occurs during crackdowns, cordon and search operations during which men are held for identification, in parks or schoolyards, while security forces search their homes. In these situations, the security forces frequently engage in collective punishment against the civilian population. Most frequently, by beating or otherwise assaulting residents and burning their homes. Rape is used as a means of targeting women whom the security forces accuse of being militant sympathizers. In raping them, the security forces are attempting to punish and humiliate the entire community. This is an excerpt from the Human Rights Watch report on Kashmir. According to United Nations Commission on Human Rights, there are roughly 1.5 million refugees from Indian-administered Kashmir, bulk of whom arrived in Pakistan-administered Kashmir. Now, these are reports written by international organizations. Luckily, today I met a young man from Kashmir and I asked him to get a real perspective, the real life scenario in Kashmir, and I asked him, what is the situation there? So that instead of believing a report written by some multinational organization, what is the real situation on the ground? According to that young man, in Indian-occupied Kashmir, armed forces rape women in a whole village. From his personal experience, he told me that one of his neighbors, who was a 10-year-old boy, was lifted by the Indian armed forces and tortured for many days. Now, it is these human rights violations that can escalate into a regional crisis because Kashmiris look towards Pakistan to help them in this cause for independence. Now, what is Pakistan's situation? What is Pakistan's position on this? Pakistan has said since 1947 that the UN resolutions that has been passed should be implemented by India. And India, as part of an international community and a member of the United Nations Charter and signatory, has a responsibility to follow on those petitions, on those resolutions adopted by UN Security Council. India has not. Now, what is Pakistan's situation today? In last few years, Pakistan has given many proposals to India. And let me tell you the last 3 proposals we gave them. Last 3 options we gave them. In the first decade of the 21st century, we wanted to resolve Kashmir issue and we gave them 3 options that we can work with. One is that they follow the UN resolution and hold the plebiscite so the Kashmiri people can decide their fate. Let it be independence. But let them decide their fate. That's the stated position of Pakistan. The other option was that the part of Kashmir that is in Pakistan control should become part of Pakistan. The southern part of Kashmir that is contiguous with the Indian borders should become part of India, and the Indian Valley and the Kashmir Valley should be declared as an autonomous independent region. And the third option was that we divide the Kashmir region into 7 districts, each autonomous and operating with their own jurisdiction, but without right to have a foreign policy or printing of money. India, unfortunately, has not progressed on all these options. Their only solution has been to send more and more troops to the occupied Kashmir, and who give them advice by the way? They get their advice from the Israelis, because Israelis are expert in occupying places and putting settlers there. So Indian tactics in Kashmir is completely similar with the Israeli tactics in Palestine. And they feel that using strong arms tactics, they can control civilian population of 12 million peaceful people. Pakistan's position is very clear. We want Kashmiri people to decide their fate, and we stand with them in that pursuit. Thank you very much.
Good evening, Salam Alaikum, Baridesank, Adabarze, Namaste, Rametse, Khush geldiniz. Always wonderful to be in Fresno and to see comrades and allies in the audience, our dear friends Vic, Rich from KFCF, the wonderful radio station here, Community Alliance editor and activist Dan Yassin and Mike Rhodes, the man who makes my visits to Fresno possible, Ed Hagopian, with his generosity. You know, I'm able to fly here from Colorado. It's good to see Sudarshan and Mary Hussein, in whose class I'm speaking twice on Friday. But especially by great good fortune, just about an hour ago, I met a Kashmiri brother here who I knew was in Fresno because we had a mutual friend who spent time with us in Colorado. And he said, when you go to Fresno, you should look up my friend, Feroz. And so we were at this restaurant around eating dinner just a little while ago, and he approached me and he said, "Are you David?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "I'm Feroz." And so we have, I think, a unique opportunity, if Feroz will agree, to get some eyewitness corroboration for some of the information that both Kundi and I will present to you. Before I do that, I also like to hand out a sign-up sheet if you'd like to know more about alternative radio. Please sign this if we don't have your email. There is a condition, though. The condition is that you write clearly. I know it's, some of you are old enough to remember there used to be a class taught in schools and colleges called penmanship. Anyone old enough to remember that? Well, it's not taught anymore, like geography and other subjects, but I hope you'll write this clearly, and I will not share this with Homeland Security, whose agents I want to strangle every single time I go to an airport in this country, like this morning when I saw them really abusive toward elderly people who are disabled. I mean, this was over the top. You know, 70, 80, 90-year-old people in wheelchairs being asked to stand up and subjected to searches. You know, there's a great poem, I was going to end with this, by Faiz Ahmed Faiz, who's the greatest Urdu poet of the 20th century, and it's called Hum Dekhenge. And we'll see the day what happens to these people. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Well, Kashmir, also known as Jannat-e-Benazir in Urdu, a land with no equal. It is a heaven on earth. That was a famous Mughal emperor, Jahangir, when he first went to Kashmir, said, supposedly in a Persian couplet, that, you know, if there is heaven on earth, it is this, it is this, it is this. Well, that heaven on earth, that paradise on earth, is a hell on earth today. As you heard in the initial comments, hundreds of thousands of Indian security forces. The number actually ranges as high as 700,000 when you include the state police, the border security forces, the Indo-Tibetan security forces, and the regular Indian army. If you put them in aggregate, it is probably close to 700,000 Indian military controlling Kashmir. What does it mean to live under occupation? Well, I've been there multiple times, and almost a year ago to the day, last September 23rd, at Indira Gandhi International Airport, I was denied entry into Kashmir. I was denied entry into India, even though I had a valid visa in my passport. To this day, no explanation has been given to me by the Indian government, but I suspect it is because of my advocacy and outspokenness on the issue of Kashmir, that the Kashmiris have the right to self-determination as any people have the right to self-determination, be it the Hopi, the Navajo, the Palestinians, or the Kashmiris. And so that principle, which I'm, have spoken about publicly, and I've done radio broadcasts about this as well, no doubt came to the attention of the world's largest democracy. India likes to promote itself in its literature as the world's largest democracy. And people like Thomas Friedman and Charlie Rose, who know nothing about India but talk about it endlessly, also repeat that cliche about the world's largest democracy. So we live in the world's second largest democracy. And I think to understand what's going on in Kashmir also, with the historical background that was given very eloquently, we have to also understand what role does the United States play. Might the United States be playing a role in South Asia? Might they be selling arms in the billions of dollars to New Delhi? Might they be conducting more military exercises with India than any other country on earth? The answer to that question, this is a rhetorical thing, those were rhetorical questions, is yes, yes, and yes. So the context of Kashmir and the refusal of Washington, successive administrations, by the way, to speak up for Kashmiri rights. Notice how quick they are to beat their breasts when somebody dies in Libya, or somebody is hurt in Syria, or something happens in Iran or North Korea. When you're a designated enemy of the empire, you will have laser-like attention to any mistake that you might make. But when you're an ally of the empire, when you're aligned with Washington, as Israel is, as many European countries are, and as India is, then you have a permanent get-out-of-jail pass. You are not subject to any scrutiny. There are no media reports about human rights violations in India, but plenty of violations going on in Iran and in Syria. So to describe US policy, not just toward India and Kashmir, but around the world as two-faced, double-sided, double-standard, probably is understating the actual meaning of those words. It's much more than that. I have a report issued by the Department of Defense about US relations with India. I'm going to quote from this for a moment here. The relationship between the United States and India, what President Obama has called one of the defining partnerships of the 21st century, is a priority to the US government and for the US Department of Defense. The United States and India are natural partners, destined to be closer because of shared interests and values and our mutual desire for a stable and secure world. I'll try not to choke when I read these words. A strong bilateral partnership is in US interests and benefits both countries. We expect India's importance to US interests to grow in the long run, as India is a major regional and emerging global power. Increasingly, it assumes roles commensurate with its position as a stakeholder and a leader in the international system. Then the Department of Defense report goes on to say, you can get this online, by the way, US-India military exercises have grown dramatically in size, scope, and sophistication. We now have regular exercises across all our armed services. More exercises, military exercises, with India than any other country. The relationship building between the US and India defense personnel is one of the Department of Defense's highest priorities, and US Special Operations Forces are interacting with Indian Special Operations Forces, and on and on. The Department of Defense is continually looking for ways to expand defense cooperation with India. And I got a whiff of that when I was in India in November of 2011, and Barack Obama came to Delhi when I was there. India is a country of 1.2 billion people. About 800 million people are living on less than 50 cents a day. Anywhere between 50 cents and a dollar. Whatever it is, it's very, very little. And so one would wonder if the leader of the world's second largest democracy might have been there to offer food aid or filtering systems for water. I mean, most of the diseases in South Asia and in India in particular are water related. There's people drinking contaminated water. Not at all. Obama was also led a delegation of 200 CEOs from the United States, some of the, the top corporate leaders, fulfilling his role, as the Marxists would describe it, as the chief executive officer of capitalism. That's actually the functioning role of the President of the United States, to protect this economic system. So, what did he sell India, you might ask? What was he there peddling? He was peddling weaponry. India bought more than $5.5 billion of weapons from the United States in a deal brokered by Obama. These were Boeing planes, military jets, and the like. Now, when one goes to Kashmir, it's an extraordinary place. I first went there in 1966. I've been back many, many times since. But when you land at the airport, you have a sense that you're entering another country, because there's, of course, a massive military presence. As soon as you exit the airport, there's concertina wire, there are towers, there are checkpoints, people are searched. As a foreigner, even though you are in India, supposedly, you are taken aside and you have to fill out a special form to enter Kashmir. Where are you going? Who are you staying with? Why are you here? If you say, you're a tourist, I've come to spend money and things like that, they're very, very happy. If you say, you're interested in investigating human rights violations, that makes the people there, of course, very, very uncomfortable. The whole majestic Kashmir Valley is a grid of army tanks, interrogation centers, watchtowers, checkpoints, and bunkers. Interrogation centers is a kind of euphemism. This is where state-sponsored torture is carried out. I've met many Kashmiris who have been tortured by Indian security forces. The numbers are probably in the hundreds of thousands. It's also very interesting when you visit any state that is occupied, as a journalist or just as a human being. You should always go to the hospitals. You should always talk to medical professionals, because they have a view of the impact of what occupation means from a very different perspective. It's not monetized in any way. It's not strategic. It's not about, Washington and New Delhi relations. It's about what's happening to the people in an area that's occupied. And I'm sure this is true in Palestine and in other places of the world that are undergoing occupation. There is a tremendous amount of stress, and because of that, because there's there are many mental problems. There's domestic violence, there's depression. I talk to Kashmiri doctors who say they have to medicate many of their patients because they feel, they're so depressed and feel suicidal, having perhaps been humiliated in some way by the security forces. Now, I'm not going to insult the intelligence of this audience by asking, how many of you have heard of Tahrir Square? I know the answer is all of you. But how many of you have heard of Eidgah in Kashmir? Other than Feroz, who's Kashmiri, and one or two others. Probably none of you. Well, 3 years before Tahrir Square, 3 years before the world was captivated by the sight of Egyptians occupying this major center in the center of Cairo, this plaza, a similar event happened in Kashmir. There was a march to the line of control, the de facto border separating Pakistani, what they call Azad Kashmir, and Indian-administered Kashmir. And then the people returned to Eidgah, which is right outside of Srinagar. It's a major mosque area, and there's a huge maidan there, an open space. And 1 million people demonstrated non-violently, peacefully. What was the First of all, the Indian state's response to that, then the international media, and then the champion of democracy, the United States of America. The response was very interesting and instructive. There was no response. There was absolute silence greeting a massive display of nonviolent civil disobedience. There was no violence at that meeting at all, and this has taken the Indian government now by tremendous surprise, because they were very happy to deal with violence. Violence plays into their hands. The Indian narrative for Kashmir is that the Kashmiri people, they're good, they're innocent, they're being manipulated by outside forces, particularly Pakistan, or the Taliban, or Al-Qaeda. They fall completely within the narrative since September 11th. They are terrorists who want to establish an Islamic state, who want to impose Sharia, that is to say Islamic law, on the people. And as long as the resistance, which began in 1989, was violent, and it was violent, tens of thousands of people were killed, the Indian state could live with that. In fact, it was quite happy to have that kind of thing, just as the Israelis were very happy to have Hamas and Hezbollah and other groups fighting them with guns, armed struggle, because that is a field in which they will clearly predominate and overwhelm any adversary. But when the tactics switched to nonviolence, then India was put in a very awkward position because of their international reputation and the massive propaganda campaign that it spends millions of dollars on around the world, convincing people that this is the land of Buddha, and it is the land of Buddha. It's the land of Gandhi. Yes, it is the land of Gandhi. Everybody's doing yoga and playing sitar and is vegetarian, and India's yada yada yada. The realities, of course, of this world's largest democracy are quite different. I have some booklets here that I've picked up on my trips to Kashmir and to India. The most significant one is called Buried Evidence: Unknown, Unmarked, and Mass Graves in Indian-Administered Kashmir. This report came out about a year after the Eidgah demonstration of 1 million people that no one knew about here or anywhere else in the so-called free world. This report, too, was met with total silence from the Indian state and from Washington and the UN as well. It documents unambiguously, in very straightforward and clear language, that of the 8,000 to 10,000 Kashmiris who have gone missing since 1989 are buried in these mass graves that have been uncovered all over the Kashmir Valley. You know how many of you know about the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, where women, the mothers of the disappeared, would gather and to ask the question, where is my son, where is my daughter? And they would hold up pictures. Well, similar things go on in Kashmir, but because of the political relationship between the United States and the propaganda that India has been very successful in implementing, nobody knows about this. There's a wonderful woman, you all know about Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar, but there's a woman there, Pravina Ahanga, that you should know about. I mean, a remarkable woman who runs an organization called the Association of the Family of the Disappeared, Families of the Association of Parents of Disappeared Persons. A remarkably courageous woman who fights the silence that surrounds all of these people that are missing. So these graves have been uncovered. I visited some of them in Kapwara district and Baramulla, not too far, about an hour or 2 hours from Srinagar, the capital of Kashmir. And the corpses reveal what? First of all, they reveal signs of torture, and they reveal signs of extrajudicial execution. That is to say, gunshot wounds to the head at very close range. So these were people that were picked up off the street. You're a Pakistani, you're Al-Qaeda, you're Taliban, what's your name, Mohammed? You're a Muslim, you're a terrorist. That's the progression that literally happens. And when you drive around Kashmir in a private car, you encounter military convoys. Now there's a protocol if you're in a car. You immediately must pull over to the side of the road and turn off your engine. This is all done while machine guns are being pointed at you. So you get the picture. You don't pull over, you don't turn off your engine, you risk being shot by the security forces. And much of what the Indian government does in Kashmir, and this doesn't distinguish it from any other rogue regime like the one in Washington when it occupies Afghanistan or bombs Pakistan or Yemen or Somalia. It's all done within a legal framework. They have lawyers there, just like we have great lawyers here like Alberto Gonzalez and John Ashcroft and John Yu and Eric Holder and others who legalize criminality. They give the imprimatur for state terrorism. So in India there's something called the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, AFSPA. It is in place not only in Kashmir, but in other parts of India, particularly in the northeast, where there has been a rebellion against Indian rule since 1947. This gives the security forces, this legal law, gives Indian security forces sweeping powers to arrest and detain anyone they suspect of being a terrorist or someone who is up to criminal activity. It's called, and there's also the Public Safety Act, which also allows the state to detain people for up to 2 years without trial and without charges. Mr. Kundi mentioned collective punishment. This is one of the techniques, of course, that the Israelis have perfected in Palestine, and the Indians have developed even further in Kashmir. That is to say, if there is someone who is suspected, not convicted, suspected of being a militant or a terrorist or has anti-state feelings in Kashmir, then the whole town or the whole village has to pay for that. This is a collective punishment, and so it doesn't distinguish between the guilty and the innocent. But who is guilty in this scenario anyway? These are people who are fighting for self-determination and sovereignty. And there was a revolt in this country, you may recall, in 1776 against an outside force that was oppressing and repressing the people. I'm going to read, I'm sorry I'm going on a little bit here, but I have a lot to say about this because I'm so intimately involved with the issue. As I said, I've been to Kashmir many, many times, and to India as well, and I was deported last year, no doubt, because of my work on Kashmir. And to this date, I have no explanation from the Indian government as to why I was deported. So it's a very Kafkaesque-like situation. I don't know what I'm being accused of and who my accuser is. So who do I write to? Who do I call? Who do I intercede with? And I mentioned this to the great Indian writer and supporter of Kashmiri rights, Arundhati Roy, and he says, and she told me, and this is how we feel. Welcome to India. This is what goes on with, we go through this all the time. Charges are made, and there is no finger, there's no hand behind the finger. There's this, it's kind of an invisible way of controlling. I've done a whole series of programs on Kashmir. You can go to my website, alternativeradio.org, and find them. Just type in Kashmir. I'm going to read some of the little write-ups to each program, just to give you a glimpse of some of the realities. And a couple of the things I've already perhaps I've mentioned here. Of course, you know, the question is, well, what do Kashmiris want? Do they want independence? Do they want the right to self-determination? Do they want to be aligned with their Muslim brothers in Pakistan? Do they want autonomy? What do they want? And the answer is given in very eloquent terms, azadi, which means freedom. They want to be the masters of their own fate, and that fate can be decided only when 700,000 Indian troops leave Kashmir. There cannot be any adjudication of this issue as long as the Indian military is an occupation force in Kashmir. You cannot have that shadow over your head and then say, okay, let's have an election. Let's have a plebiscite that had been promised by Nehru multiple times to the Kashmiris and to the world community, which he then reneged on. So the nara, the slogan goes up, you know, aap kya chahte hain? They say, azadi, azadi, freedom. India is hot. Its meteoric rise as an economic power with a growing number of millionaires and billionaires is a great story. Not quite. Politically, India has gone from its Nehru-inspired non-alignment to aligning itself with Washington. Its priorities mirror its mentors. 20% of the country's budget goes to the military, while education gets about 5%, and public health is scant 1%. One could say almost, you know, pretty close to numbers here in the world's second largest democracy. A journalist, Praful Bidwai, independent journalist that I know in Delhi, writes, "We are a poor country, and we are spending like crazy on guns, while 80% of Indians live on less than 20 rupees, 50 cents per day. They have little access to clean water and electricity. The contrasts and contradictions are sharp and widening between the rich, who live well-lit lives of opulence, and the indigent, who are literally in darkness." Also sounds a little bit like what's going on here in the United States. That last expression is about the numerous blackouts in Kashmiri towns and villages, while hydroelectric power, which is coming from the great rivers of Kashmir, light up Delhi and Allahabad and Kanpur and other major cities of India, and the people of Kashmir are sitting around in the dark. And the winters there are very severe indeed. There are myriad types of terrorism, but the focus is highly selective. For example, 250,000 Indian farmers killing themselves is not regarded as a form of terrorism, nor are massacres of Muslims in the Indian states of Gujarat and Maharashtra, or of Sikhs in New Delhi, nor are the tens of thousands of Kashmiris killed by the Indian military. The attention and emphasis of the media is overwhelmingly on car bombings, September 11th, and Mumbai-type attacks. Massive state terrorism is not up for discussion unless the state is a designated enemy of Washington, as I mentioned earlier. Can you imagine Charlie Rose or Wolf Blitzer asking Kissinger or Rice or Hillary Clinton about state terrorism? It's never going to happen. Maybe when pigs fly, they'll ask those questions. The ads on TV whisper, "Incredible India," and then you see images of temples, colorful textiles, yogis, tigers, and of course, the inevitable Taj Mahal. It's almost a cliche. India, the world's largest democracy. However, democracy is more than just elections. Very much like the United States again. It's more than just elections. When you examine the actual policies of the Indian state, you find a country with acute inequalities. Alongside its IT billionaires, Bollywood and cricket stars, and industrial magnates, there are more hungry people in India than in all of sub-Saharan Africa combined. A juggernaut of injustices has sparked a wave of rebellions in the country. The one in Kashmir is one of the oldest. I mentioned in the northeast, in Assam, Meghalaya, Nagaland, that part of the country. Those uprisings, those revolts against New Delhi are fundamentally different from what's going on, let's say, in Orissa and Chhattisgarh and Maharashtra and Madhya Pradesh and other states. In those states, these are Marxist rebellions, so-called Maoist rebellions. They want to replace the Indian state with another form of government. They don't want to secede from India. But the uprisings in the northeast and in Kashmir are about secession from India. And so the Indian state has created this mythology about itself being, all-encompassing and multinational, multiracial, multi-religious, and it is true to some extent. And so it has put an enormous amount of investment, emotional, political, military, economic investment into holding Kashmir no matter what. But its situation is untenable. It cannot last. You cannot forever repress a people by military occupation. Sooner or later, that is going to break, and Kashmiris will have azadi of one form or another. That is inevitable. Everyone knows that. Any educated person who is aware of the situation feels that it cannot be sustained indefinitely. And like the US wars, you see, the US is an aggressive international power. It strides the earth with its bases and its troops. India is an internal imperialism. It is not occupying other countries. It is occupying states within the state. So it's a very different. Well, I think this is the major unresolved issue of 1947. Again, as was mentioned by Mr. Kundi in his opening remarks, many unresolved issues from that time, actually, when the imperial cartographers went to work drawing lines between the Durand Line in 1893, separating the Pashtun people of what is now Pakistan and the Pashtuns of Afghanistan, divisions in Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, again, imperial cartographers at work, in Cyprus as well, imperial cartographers at work, Ireland, wherever the British and French empires put their foot. When they left, there was often much chaos in its departure. We see that in Central and East Africa as well, where cartographers sitting in London and Paris, who had never even been to these countries, couldn't speak any of the language, knew any of the culture, said, oh, there's a river here. Let's put the border there. Oh, this is a big mountain here. Let's have a border behind the mountain. I mean, this is how the maps were drawn. That's why conflict has continued in these particular areas. So there's a lot more to say about Kashmir, about oppression. I just want to mention, as I started with, Faiz Ahmed Faiz, the greatest Urdu poet of the 20th century. He was born in Sialkot in Punjab in 1911. He died in 1984. He was a Red. Can we say that? He was a communist and proud to be one. He was a journalist and proud to be one. He was a poet and proud to be one. He spent years in jail under US-supported military dictators like Ayub Khan. That's a remarkable personality, and his poetry is known throughout, not just Pakistan, but throughout India, even in Nepal and in Bangladesh as well. One of his most famous poems is Hum Dekhenge. Lazim hai ke hum bhi dekhenge, wo din ka jiska wada hai, jo loe azal mein likha hai. I'm going to give you a rough translation. We will see that day. Necessarily, we will see the time coming when repression and oppression will float away like cotton wool in the air, when the crowned heads will shake, when thrones will tremble, and all we will see before us is the people demanding justice under the eye of God. Thank you very much.
Zindagi hindi saaz wazan gam chala